Okay. Okay, so today we're going to talk about your writing and your writing journey and a little bit about your latest book. So what started you off as a writer? What made you want to write?
Well, first off, let me say thank you for having me this evening. I really appreciate your interest in the novel, your support of it. I'm thrilled to be here to chat with you more about it. So I suppose what started me off was when I was 8 years old and living on the island of Corsica, fairly isolated, didn't speak the language, new to the culture. I was already a reader, but my aunt sent me a massive, and I mean a big box of books. It must have had 20, 25 books in it. And they were kind of classics in children's literature, but they were also my grandmother's plays. So I had, on one hand, wonderful reading material that was really rich and helped me develop my imagination. On the other hand, I had kind of this sense already of a bit of a lineage of writing in my family. And I don't know that I knew it was a privilege then, but it's so obvious to me now what the privilege was in that there was someone who was sort of guiding a hand. And I believe that my grandmother may have already passed on by then. I never met her, actually. But my aunt, who sent me the books, I was quite close to, and my middle name is named after her, Jean. So she was a huge influence. And I started writing plays. They were awful.
Yeah, who says they were awful? Is that, what, was it you as a child who thought they were awful, or was it you now as
I think I remember reading. Yeah, I remember reading them aloud to my stepmom, and I think she just kind of got this really funny look on her face. But she just nodded and smiled. It was completely the right reaction. She's a huge supporter of my creative life and always has been. She's a painter, and so hugely influenced me as well. But I think as much as anything, it was also the reading that I had already been a big reader. Like when I was 6, I read the Edgar Eger series, which was 6 books, 6 times before I trotted it back to the library. But when I was in Corsica, these were really full-length books, and I was reading one a day. So that love of reading's never stopped. And I think a lot of why I do write is because I love reading.
Yeah, that makes sense, I think. So now that you're a proper grown-up writer, do you have a writing routine, or is it random?
I do. It's been a bit slow in coming because I think the challenge that everyone, especially once you're like adult, holding a job, have a family, loads of responsibilities, locating that that chute in which you can, that time slot so that you can actually get work done is not simple. And I have relied on this 100 days of writing, kind of hashtag 100 days of writing, that I believe Jen Ashworth coined. That's the belief anyway, on Facebook and on the web. And I sometimes will just do 50 days. And this summer things fell off a bit. I'm not sure I got all 50 days in, but it does kind of keep me true to the process. And I do try to be forgiving of that. And sometimes I'll just work on marketing connected to the book. It wouldn't necessarily be, words on the page every day. But when I am earnestly trying to finish a novel, I am on it every day until it's done. And as we went through our various phases on editing, I had to bear down pretty seriously on those revisions. And in some ways, it's the hardest point, and in some ways, it's the most wonderful point. I had a client, because I do editorial work. I had a client who was very excited to learn yesterday that the novel was out. And he asked what that was like. And I said, it's wonderful on one hand, but I said, you know what? Nothing beats actually writing the book. Like, I just think that that's what gives me my greatest joy. And that's why I'm in it, with all the challenges that it entails.
Yeah. And so your particular day job is being an academic. You kind of said a little bit about that.
What was that? Can you just repeat that? Sorry.
Your particular day job is working at a university as an academic.
Yeah, it is. It is tricky.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think in some ways that's where I really work between the cracks. So if I wake up early, I'll just pull the laptop out and get to work because I know I might have an hour and a half before I have to start my day. I did that this morning and got a lot of things sorted. So there's that. And I suppose also I feel as though I'm modeling for them writing. So if I'm going to try to push them on reading and, being in the work, I kind of feel as though I need to align with what I'm saying. I need to walk the walk, not just talk it. But it's actually kind of an unexpected pleasure. It's not that I didn't like teaching before, but it's been lovely, to, for instance, share with them the day I got the news about Chapeltown / Bridge House Publishing picking up the novel. They were the first people to learn about it, was my students on researching.
Oh, lovely.
They all were so excited, Jill. They were like,
yes.
So it's not easy, and you would know that because you're a writer who also taught. You taught at Salford in particular, so you know that world quite well, better than I do because I've not been there as long. It's tricky, but it's a really nice way to connect your writing with kind of being out in the world too.
And do you have a dedicated space for writing? Do you have a room of your own?
I mean, I have a room of my own, but it serves many functions. We're in a 2 up, 2 down, so there's always space constraints. I'm a big believer in I have to be in a space that I'm comfortable working in that moment. And I listen to music a lot. I listen to a lot of instrumental work to just kind of get in the zone, as I call it. It's a term that my eldest uses. She was a swimmer for many years competitively. And she would talk about getting on the board and getting in the zone. And I feel as a writer, you do that same thing. And I think most writers kind of do that intuitively over time. They've figured out, do they need a cup of coffee or do they need some chocolate? I'm a big fan of chocolate personally.
A lot of procrastination techniques or something. Yeah.
I know.
Do you ever write in cafes or on the train or
Actually, it's funny you should ask that because I'm pretty sure that Backstroke, which is one of the first short stories that was published, is I think I wrote that in a cafe on campus, and I had like 2 hours. I was on the MA course, and I had started a workshop called Sixers, and we were writing 6 short stories in 6 weeks. And I had this idea about this. I'd gotten the idea swimming, actually, about a character whose mother was a competitive swimmer. And to be fair, my daughter was a competitive swimmer, and that was part of why I was in the pool. But what I ended up doing was just, in that environment, sometimes you have to kind of create your own space when you've got other voices going on. And I'll often have, the earphones in. And it takes me forever and a day to actually edit a story, but I can get one written quickly in terms of the bare bones, in the same way that I wrote Dry River initially as a dare on National Novel Writing Month. And I believe it was 24 days total that I just did like 55,000 words that became the skeleton of the work. But yes, I do work in those different spaces, and maybe less so in trains. It's kind of a tough one. Everybody's so close.
Everybody has different ways, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
So tell me a little bit about native writing in the academy. What's that like? So,
I think every university I've taught at, and I've taught at 4 here, I did a guest lecture at a 5th, but essentially it was 4 universities that I taught at for either a term or a couple of terms. And at Salford, where I've been since 2019, what I've done is I've sort of brought everything I've ever learned from workshop, and that was not just in the UK, but in the US. I was fortunate to get an Elizabeth George grant in 2008 when I was trying to make this transition from writing oral history to writing fiction. And I'd been writing some creative nonfiction. It was my prison book project. Hadn't quite gone. So I was just steering around back into fiction, which is what I'd started in. And so I draw on these, experiences of workshop at various writers' conferences throughout the States that I was able to go to do some studying through this grant. Um, so in terms of teaching creative writing, then what I've done is I've sort of brought that that set of that toolkit with me. And my one of my tutors at Manchester, Jeanette Winterson, when I said, I'm going to be teaching creative writing, what am I going to do? I think back in 2017 or whatever it was, when I was going to teach the fiction workshop, I think it was 2015 actually. And she said, Alicia, just teach them what you know. I went, oh, okay. So that's what I do, but I do a lot of augmenting with, new work that I've found and picked up along the way, things that I know work really well for teaching setting. I'm very big on craft, to be honest, because I think it's great to experiment, but I think it's really good for people to know the rules before they're breaking them, as it were.
I mean, a lot of people I know say, oh, I can't afford to take a university course. I've had to learn it on the job and all that sort of thing. It's high profile writers who say you can't teach creative writing. What's your take on that?
Well, it's interesting. I worked for an editor who basically said he didn't think creative writing could be taught. And I suppose I'm somewhere in between, because I do think you can learn a great deal on your own. And in fact, one of the writers I studied with, Julia Glass, who wrote 3 Junes, her first novel, and won a National Book Award. And what she'd done is she'd read 30 novels before she wrote the book. And, it's a totally legitimate way to launch a writing career. I work with all writers at all different levels on my editorial work that I do alongside teaching at the uni. And many of them, won't go get a master's. They either don't have time, funds, what have you. And so I kind of almost feel like it's a social service that I'm kind of bringing my skill set to a variety of venues where people can benefit from it. I'm constantly growing as a writer, and I think that's part of what I bring to my teaching. Is that pushing the craft for ourselves always. I think that's just kind of the nature of being a writer. And my aunt used to say that every book is its own problem. So every time I'm on a new book, I'm like, okay, new set of problems, time to put on my, my writer's thinking cap. But in terms of, whether people have to do an MFA to write, they don't. But what I think an MFA does do is give people time and permission to commit to the work. And that's a real plus.
I guess the fees help with the discipline, because you're saying you've got to make it work. I guess there's that. So you've mentioned one or two other projects. So what would you say the actual? Well, if I was asking for your bio right this minute, could you sum it up in a couple of sentences?
So sum it up. Which was that last part? Sorry.
Your writing CV in a couple.
Oh, my writing CV. So I suppose my writing really started with oral history. So, I mean, to be fair, I did an undergraduate degree in English with a concentration in creative writing. It was before they had like 5 zillion MFA courses in the USA. Or even that many creative writing departments. And I studied with a poet, Constance Hunting, who also was a publisher like yourself. She taught and she was a publisher. She was wonderful. And so I worked with her one-on-one. And then I ended up falling in love with oral history through a folklorist that I studied with, Sandy Ives, and elected to go to graduate school in folklore because I kind of fell in love with oral history and taking other people's stories and creating something from those. And that turned into a 20-year career unexpectedly. I was just actually joking with my eldest that I never did an interview for a job, really, maybe one in 20 years, because it just was all word of mouth that my work kind of progressed. So it was really fortunate that way.
Oral history and word of mouth, I mean, that's quite appropriate.
And so what happened then was that when my first book came out, and it did well, unexpectedly. I'd worked on it for an age, but you just never know what a book will do in the world. And then at that point, I realized, I really need to turn back toward writing. And so I made a tough call. I left an organization that I loved, the Southern Oral History Program, where I'd worked in a variety of capacities: assistant director, projects director, research associate. And I did some important work there in terms of my own career. I finished the Penobscot book when I was working there. I Was Content and Not Content: The Story of Linda Lord and the Closing of Penobscot Poultry. And then I also developed the oral history project in the prison that's now the subject of my next nonfiction book. But I just knew I needed to get back to writing. I needed that 8-year-old in me had not given up the dream, basically.
Yeah.
And so that's what brought me here. When my novel didn't quite work, I came to
Okay, so let's get on to talking about the book.
Yeah.
What's part of the basic idea of the novel?
So the basic idea of the novel was a retelling of Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose, which I happened to read rather kind of remarkably when I think about it now, as we were traveling across country to move to California. And so what happened was, after the second crash in 2008, when I was witnessing people losing their homes to foreclosure, literally on our block, like our next door neighbor, and further down the block as well, I realized I had a story to tell, and that there was a way in which, as I looked around, no one had done the Wallace Stegner story redux. And so I elected to set it in sort of a Silicon Valley setting. I didn't live in Silicon Valley. I'd spent time in that area before Silicon Valley had kind of hit it big and had kind of radically altered that part of the Bay Area. And I just started with that. And then I was studying with this editor, Tom Jenks, at the time. And so he had said, Alicia, have each chapter have a kind of action, conflict action resolution, like create a mini story arc for your chapters. And so that's what I did. I knew I had the concept, and then I dove in. And that's where we've landed all these years later.
Yeah, excellent. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of writing?
Yeah. So, I mean, literally, I think the one thing I didn't say in response to that last one is that the idea came to me whilst I was sweeping my kitchen floor. And, and I loved the domesticity of that. I don't see it as a domestic novel. I see it as a novel about economics and how they shape our lives. But, it was a small action. And I think oftentimes writing is very much these small actions, these small moments, the specificity. And it's how we get into the lives of our characters, right? What's going on in their world that affects them, the small things, micro settings. So the process, I drafted it at that point, and then I worked on it on and off for about 2 years. And then when my agent was not wild about it, I went, oh gosh, I think I need to figure out how to make this book work. And what she said to me was, if you're going to go do a degree, do it in fiction, because nonfiction's your strong suit. So off we trotted for what was going to be a year. I found out when I got here that the course was not going to let me do the book. Like, they said, we're not a book doctor course. You just have to start something new. So that's why I co-founded Sixers, my workshop for the short stories initially. And also I was fortunate enough, because I got support to do the PhD. At that point, I argued with them that I didn't want to work on both novels I didn't want to work on the new PhD novel for 4 years. So they kind of took pity on me, Jill.
Right.
Said, okay. So I wrote new material for the master's, because I had to kind of be within the legal parameters. But my favorite time period working on it was in Michigan. And I call it the Michigan rewrite, because that's when I worked on it. I wouldn't say 6 to 8 hours a day, but pretty darn near close, for 3 weeks. And I would get up every morning. I would go run on the lake. I was on a student budget, so I was skinny as a rail, because I think I was eating peanut butter and crackers for lunch probably. And then, swimming, and then I'd go back, and I had no distractions, because I didn't know anybody except for the family that I was staying with, who were linked to the camp where my girls were. And so that was kind of it. And then in 2016, when I was on the PhD and thinking I needed to start sending out novels at that point, I asked a good colleague of mine from the magazine I'd worked at, Narrative, Olga Zilberberg, to read it. And I just, she kindly, at mates rates, read it for me. And I said, should I put it on the shelf? And she said, no. She said, it's New York agent ready. And it was still a number of years before I could get back to it fully because of the PhD. But you recall my earlier versions of it. Even up to the end, I was tinkering.
Yeah, and there'll be one day when you're doing a reading of it and you think, oh, change that sentence.
Oh, I know. That's just so classic. I know. Don't you find that too, right? When you're reading, you go, oh gosh, I'd have dropped that word if I was, had my writer's cap on that day.
Well, there was I invited her to read a writer when I was at Salford.
Yeah.
She had been a student at Salford.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Before. Got her MA elsewhere, got a PhD.
Yeah.
Wrote a novel published by Unbound, which is a different, quirky publisher, but they're very good. And she's only been out a few days, and she came and read to the first year. She got halfway down the first paragraph. She just laughed. And tell my students what to do that. She'd done something in the first paragraph. And I thought we never stop editing. I don't think.
No, we don't. No, yeah. In fact, and I think as writers, we read differently because if we don't like sentences, we'll rewrite them in our heads.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I think sometimes a text needs different when you read it out loud from when somebody reads it in the head.
Yeah.
So it's been out a few weeks now. Have you had any feedback?
Have I had any feedback? I have. I mentioned, when we did the original blog interview that I'd had a family member who sent me an Instagram message at some ungodly hour back in California. And she was like, I got the Kindle version and the hard copies on the way, and I can't stop reading it tonight, and I thought it's hooking readers. I think what's been really fun, Jill, is that people have come back to me. One reader wants me to write a sequel and gave me suggestions for what that sequel should entail, which I just loved. And it kind of said to me that these characters are living on for readers in a way that I hadn't expected. This was not the novel that I thought was going to take first. I presume it was going to be the PhD novel, The Other Side of Darwin, which is quite a different work. But I think I was just very passionate about Dry River, which is why I couldn't let it go. But the other thing in terms of reader response is that several people said, very early on, within a week, I want to use this book for our book club. So already,
I mean, after that discussion, I thought, book club I'm in, would do it some good, I think. So I mean, it probably won't be till September.
Yeah.
I'll raise it with them, then I've got to get the copies to them.
Yeah.
But I also mentioned Miss Flexia, and I think it is
that's
very much a novel that would appeal to that readership.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think we should go that direction. It's been really fun working with you, Jill. And I think I've mentioned this before. The editorial process was so helpful, and you flagged some things that had been sort of issues in the book that I hadn't figured out how to solve. And I think talking them through, via email or when we met up on campus, a number of months ago, all of it worked together to, help me smooth out the rough edges. And that's been really exciting. And now, thinking about how to get it out in the world, there's going to be multiple launches at this point because we've had the the June launch, I presented at the research seminar at Salford, but we're having, as you know, a big launch where you'll be featured with the press to expose students to the possibilities of publishing with you, which is great. And then also my fellow artist on the project, Andy Brody, who's a lecturer at UCLan, absolutely fabulous artist, agreed to do the cover design, as you know, and he's both been at the launch at Anthony Burgess Foundation and will join us. Yes, yes. Join us at Salford too.
She can come to the September launch if you see it before September.
Yeah, 14th.
Really interesting about that.
Yes, the creation of that. He'll talk all about that. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
So, without giving any spoilers, do you have a favorite character apart from your main character?
That's interesting. You know, I think I'm quite fond of Larry, the middle brother. I think, you know, it's interesting. One of the readers who wanted the sequel said to me that he felt that the book also raises, among the many questions that it raises, which is kind of what I wanted the book to do, was to raise a lot of questions, is the question of, you know, what makes a good man? And I hadn't thought about that. I often thought about the novel in terms of Sarah's identity as a woman, you know, as a working mother, and the complexities of that, especially with aging parents, etc. But his question or comment about how, you know, he couldn't work out if he liked Zeke or didn't like Zeke, which I kind of wanted people to be on the fence like that. But I never thought about the book as also raising the question of what constitutes a good man. And I think Larry, who doesn't fit the norm, you know, he teaches music in the schools, he's, you know, does some eBay selling, blah, 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 you know, kind of more on the margins there in the San Francisco Bay Area, not like his professional brother, Ephraim, who's the architect. But there's something very real about Larry and very loving. And I think he's very compassionate. And he's sort of the sibling that Sarah aligns with, I think, on, you know, her move back to California, and, you know, her family's based in Albany. So there's probably other characters that I like as well. But I think Larry captures something that I think is maybe a little bit about the old California. I think I grew up in the old California, and I was a bit of a reluctant recipient of the new California when we were out there. And in fact, Andy Brody, when we had these wonderful conversations, you know, as he was creating the cover, which, by the way, he will do an exhibition for the launch in September at Salford, we talked a lot about the book and about these characters. And he said, "You don't paint California in a very good light, Alicia." I was like, I guess so. But, you know, the book is bigger than about California and its economy. It's really meant to be about economic forces broadly and the ways in which they play on our lives. And we don't always realize that, the way that happens. But Larry, I think I hold him in a bit of a sweet spot as a character.
Yeah, he's pleasant. He's not as wound up as bad things as some of the others, I think.
I think he marches to a bit of a different drummer. He's not, you know, he doesn't have the same kinds of agendas that some of the characters have in the novel. And I did want characters to be flawed. And I think both Sarah and Ty are flawed, and that's part of why we like them, and we both root for them, and then we get frustrated about their behaviors at times. And I think that kind of complicated character is what keeps us reading, really.
Yeah. Okay, good. So thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.